All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our second year of Suicide Prevention Month. I'm so grateful to have Anne here. As always, this content is proprietary and confidential information of the Florida Firefighter Safety and Health Collaborative. It is not intended to be distributed by any party without written consent of the collaborative. Attendees should note that the educational component of this session is being recorded and will be published to our YouTube page. To maintain complete confidentiality, an announcement will be made before recording begins, and only the presenter will be identified during the recording. Therefore, to ensure your privacy, all attendees are asked to mute their microphones until an announcement is made that the recording is complete. Presentations are intended for educational purposes only and do not replace independent professional judgment. The ideas expressed in this presentation are the professional opinion of our amazing presenter and do not necessarily represent those of the Florida Firefighter Safety and Health Collaborative or its constituents. Before acting on any of the information presented, attendees should consider the appropriateness of the information as it pertains to their individual situation and seek independent professional advice should any concerns arise. If you or anyone you know are in what is believed or perceived to be a situation that is or may become harmful, please reach out to the National Suicide Prevention Hotline via 1-800-273-8255 or 988 on your phones, or through their website, suicidepreventionhotline.org, or dial 911 in the event of an emergency. I'm going to give it over to someone who artfully presents all the time. And Anne, we're so grateful to welcome you here this evening. And thank you for your story that you're going to share with us and the importance of understanding mental health and suicide prevention. So if you want to introduce yourself, we're ready to go to learn and grow with you. Thanks again.
Great. Okay, well, first, what I'd like to do for people who are here and who might be watching later is just take a minute and welcome everybody into the space. And in doing that, I want to take a look around and see who's here. And that is to say, not to look at you, but to actually see you. Again, people who are here tonight and then whoever might be watching later. And I want to get a sense for familiar faces and see who is familiar to me here. I'm looking around, I see that there's not a single unfamiliar face. And I really am really grateful about that. Everyone is a familiar face. And by that, I mean, when I was 6 years old, I was out in the front yard and the electrical company was coming by to work on the lights. And there was a guy up in the bucket in a hard hat. And I was talking to him. And my mom comes out after a while yelling at me on the porch, "Ann, come in. You're not supposed to talk to strangers." And I said, "Mom, he's not a stranger. He's the light guy." And so I'm not all that accustomed to meeting strangers. And I feel like this moment is no different. There's no exception tonight. I want to thank you for being here. There are many places you could be here and now and things that you could be doing with your time. And my hope is that it will be of time well spent together. To that end, I'd like to share for us out loud what my intention is. And that is that whatever happens here somehow serves the highest good and the greatest expression of who we are and who we're meant to be in our lived experience. I do plan to use this opportunity selfishly, and that is to say some things that I also need to hear. So I'm as much an audience member as anyone else to what's going to be said and shared. There is no easy way to talk about what we're going to talk about. Suicide prevention awareness. I'm going to give it my best shot. And even if I pull it off and we actually get the best out of me, it's going to be imperfect. To give it my best, I'm going to have to be vulnerable and probably get intimate. For obvious reasons, true intimacy and vulnerability require at least two people, or in other words, a witness or an audience. And we do have at least two people here, me and you. It's said that it takes courage to be vulnerable and even more courage to be intimate. This is true, and often the one being actively vulnerable and or intimate, in this case me, gets all the courage credit. But I've found that as I've spent time in spaces like this, and increasingly over the last couple of years talking about my personal experience, I've come to realize that there's a great deal of courage required by the audience, or in this case, you. The one that's receiving, listening, and holding space. It takes courage to listen without judgment. To let our assumptions aside, to suspend our beliefs and our disbeliefs enough to hear what's actually being shared. And there's a difference between storytelling and story sharing. And what I plan to do tonight is story share, meaning that it requires some active participation on your part to share the space and hear what's being told. As some of you might know, 7 years ago, I tried to kill myself, and I did survive a very violent suicide attempt. And I'll be sharing some of the details from that experience. With that in mind, I want to invite all of us to call forth our most courageous selves into the conversation. And what do I mean by courage? If we're older than 12 or 13, and we've been told no, or been rejected, disappointed, or let down more than once in our life, one time is not enough. It's got to be more than once. Then we're more than well acquainted with bravery. None of us would have made it out of our teenage years, or certainly not this far, without a healthy dose of bravery, and that's admirable. It's the ability to determine cause and effect, to predict, to take calculated risks and mitigate consequences. Bravery knows things, and the action taken in this knowing is considered brave. But courage, on the other hand, is in the realm of the unknown. And that's the aspect that I'm inviting us to call forward here tonight, our most courageous selves. And these are parts of ourselves that we might not have been in touch with since we were little, before 12 or 13. The part of us that doesn't know anything, that hasn't lost confidence in magic, that's not certain of anything, that remains at our core curious, creative, and compassionate. And that's the part that I want to speak to tonight. The most courageous, curious, creative, and compassionate parts of ourselves. My suicide attempt wasn't my proudest moment. And it's not easy to talk about, but I think that the closer we get to death, the closer we get to wisdom. And if there's anything that my suicide attempt has taught me, it's that I really don't know anything. And that can be terrifying territory to stand in, especially I think those of us who are in service, whether it be EMS services, first responders, or the military. We have to know things and have confidence in what we know. And I was, in 2015, I was experiencing a culmination of life experiences that were overwhelming. So I, at that point, had served 10 years in the military. And I flew helicopters for 6.5 years and then did psychological operations for another 4. I had brain surgery in 2010, and my health took a nosedive. I was put on mental behavioral health drugs. And because in the military, I move around, there was a lack of continuity of care. And when I got to the Command and General Staff College, they changed my mental behavioral health drugs. I was having a lot of medical symptoms and physical symptoms, and kind of bouncing around to different doctors and not getting any answers. And I could feel my career slipping through my fingers. Like I just knew I knew my body could not keep up with the demands of military service. And they had set up an appointment for me to go get an analysis at the Mayo Clinic. It was going to be a 2-week-long assessment. And 2 days before I was set to go, I was too afraid to fly. I was developing all these phobias and just really out of character. And I one night I decided to go out in my car and go out for a drive, and I had every intention of coming back. And I went out, and it was a two-door FRS, Scion FRS. And I got up to speed, and it pulled my body, and I saw this exposed beam under a bridge. And then I got the thought, if I could get up speed enough and run into that pole, I would have an aortic contusion. And having been on accident investigations, I kind of knew about crash sequences. And so from the time that idea planted to the time of execution, it was maybe five hours, from 8 p.m. to like 4 a.m. And a lot of times with suicide awareness, prevention awareness, they'll say, people give away their things, there are signs and symptoms, but there was none of that in my case. It was very spontaneous. Prior to that, the only thought that I had really had was it would be nice to go to sleep and not wake up. That's the only thought I really had, nothing beyond that. And outwardly, it looked as though I had everything going for me. I'm a major in the United States Army. I'm under the wing of a 3-star general, being groomed for career progression. I'm at the top of my class. I've got everything going for me. Behind the scenes, I was dealing with medical issues mounting up, changing mental behavioral health drugs, increased anxiety, inability to sleep, pain, all kinds of issues like that. So when I got this idea, being a perfectionist, a type A personality, I decided, well, if I'm going to do this, I'm really going to do it. So I went to Walmart and I bought scissors to cut out my seatbelt, cut out my airbags, but got a wire to put around the driver's seat, thinking if I don't get the crash internal concussion, I was hoping to either decapitate or asphyxiate myself. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a really, I wanted to be done and out. And I decided to give myself one last tank of gas. I went and filled my gas tank up, and I'm driving around, thinking, listening to music on the radio, And then finally it's starting to come to sunup. It's like between 4 and 5 in the morning. And I thought, well, I don't want rush hour traffic to get me. And I mean, so I picked out a light pole and I got, did a few practice runs and I floored it. I think at 120 miles an hour, ran into the pole, tore my car in half, lit it on fire. And I wake up in the ER. I got a permanent marker and wrote DNR on my forehead. And turns out I took out the lights for the whole block. They came, EMS services, and thank God, I mean, whoever stabilized me, I ended up breaking my neck. I have a C6-7 fusion, and was loss of consciousness, I think 4 hours or something. So whoever handled me, I'm always grateful for EMS services, the training and the perfectionism, professionalism. Whoever handled me, the doctors always tell me when they show me the thing that it's a miracle that I'm not paralyzed. And when I wrote DNR on my forehead in permanent marker, and I wake up in the ER and I begged the doctor, please, like, I don't know what you have to do, but botch, take care of me, take me out. And he said, I don't know what's going on with you, but we're going to get you fixed up and get you out on your way. And there, it was kind of like getting caught with my hand in the cookie jar, right? Like here I was, and really up until that point, I really hadn't failed at anything I set out to do. I had always been successful. Like I said, type A personality, perfectionist, high achiever. And there I was, I mean, I'm in a neck brace. I had pretty much mangled up the whole right side of my body. And this was in Kansas City. There's not really ever a good time to try to kill yourself, but the winter time is especially difficult because it's freezing cold and a lot of drug addicts are trying to come in off the streets and they go into the psych ward, and that's where I was. So I landed in the psych ward and I was suddenly found myself surrounded by people coming off of, cocaine and heroin and like heavy drugs. And I had never been exposed to that. And I thought, my God, if I survive this suicide attempt, I hope I'm going to survive out of this psych ward. I have no idea what's going on. And I remember sitting in the psych ward and watching on the TV. It was one of the worst winters that Kansas had, the freezing ice streets and everything. And I remember seeing these news reports of cars, full cars, going off the road at like 45, 50 miles an hour, and whole cars of people dying. They were reporting family of 4 just died, car off the road, out of control, all had their seatbelts on. You can imagine I'm sitting in this psych ward up in a neck brace, my, kind of propped up with my hand and my foot, and I'm thinking, how in the world I'm 120 miles an hour into a light pole, rip my car in half, and here I am. And as best I can tell, statistics that they report on suicide would have you believe that it's easy to kill yourself. They talk about 22 veterans a day, right? Was at the height of the suicide epidemic, and that 22 veterans a day kill themselves. But the headline that does not make it out often is how many people try and don't succeed. In my own personal experience, I found that it's not easy to, the body and the spirit is incredibly resilient. And in fact, one of the nurses in the psych ward, said to me that she'd been in the business for a long time, 40 plus years as a psych nurse specifically. And the first thing they do is take your toxicology. And mine was perfectly clean. And she said they'd never seen, for something so violent, it's very rare. Like typically you have to really get yourself inebriated or somehow out of your consciousness to be able to take such dramatic measures. And mine was perfectly clean. So she then, and I guess I should also share that prior to this, I didn't really know much about suicide at all. Had no thoughts of it. If somebody were to told me 8, 10 years ago that I would be sitting here on an evening like tonight talking about suicide, I wouldn't have believed it. I don't think anybody who knew me would believe it. So I think that says to me that it can happen to anyone. None of us are immune to suicide risk. And since then, I've spent a lot of time in support groups, PTSD groups. I've met many people who've tried to kill themselves through violent means. I mean, gunshot wounds to the head, and they've got, parts of their face missing, and they've survived. And it's not easy to kill yourself. And that's probably one of my biggest safety measures is when I occasionally, it doesn't happen as much now as it did when I was going through transition from my career, which is essentially a grief process. When I would get suicidal ideation, I would kind of have this thing in the back of my head that where the doctor's telling me, you're lucky to even be walking. And I would think, well, no matter how bad today is and how I can't see any light at the end of the tunnel, I don't want to do something to myself that's going to make it worse, because there's no guarantee, and I would research about people jumping from, how high up do you have to be to jump? How much do you have to weigh yourself down to be able to pull it off? And then I would go on and I Google it, and I found all these things about the miracle jumpers of 9/11. I mean, my God, they're up there hundreds of feet, and somehow, some way, they survived the jump. And I thought, my God, well, that's my safety factor. And I think that, having been a helicopter pilot, and I flew the OH-58 Delta, which is the Army's Scout Attack platform. It's got Hellfire 50 cal and rockets. And I was deployed during the surge to Iraq in 2007 to 8. And I think in the process of my service, I got this sense of superiority. There's these talks of like being out ahead of the aircraft, and that we used to have time on target plus or minus 60 seconds, right? I mean, it's like when you're managing that amount of data, and we would pre-cock the cockpit, set all the bells and whistles and the switches to be able to run out there and get on on the scene and respond. And I mean, when I think about how high my adrenaline was going and how precisely I had to be plugged in, and all that, I would manage 5 radios in the cockpit: air to air, air to ground, air to 911, air to fast movers, the internal radio. I mean, it's like so much data. And I think it made me overconfident. And so when things started not going my way, another thing, I got it in my mind that, well, if I decide I'm going to do something, then I'm going to do it. And that's just the way that it's going to go. And I never anticipated that I would have to live with, I want to say the consequences is too hard of a word, but the aftermath of that choice that I made, that was made in probably an overconfident mindset. And that's why I say courage does not know anything. And that's what makes it courageous. Courage doesn't have everything figured out. Courage doesn't know what's next. Bravery might. Bravery has got some things lined up and has kind of figured out, consequences, risk mitigation, but courage just takes a deep breath and says, my God, this might not make any damn sense, but I'm just going to trust. And I had lost faith and confidence in my circumstances. And something else that might be relevant was that when I was in Iraq, I was a platoon leader flying missions when we first got there. So we would do convoy security, close air support, and this IED emplacement engagement. So we would go out in the early morning, and with our sight, the enemy would be digging in the road and put bombs in. And we would engage with hellfire from standoff. And we were at the height of the surge. We were probably engaging 2, 3 a night. So, a dozen a week or so. And then halfway through my deployment, the rules of engagement narrowed. And they started, you might remember, hearts and minds became the focus. And they started accusing us of being like cowboys and hot on the trigger. So the commander had to really defend his decisions for engagement. We started going out with the ground unit and assessing for collateral damage. And what I found out as a battle captain, there was only 2 of us that would go out on these collateral damage assessments, and we would dole out compensation for anything that we damaged or destroyed. And what I found out on the ground was that the enemy was going around in daylight hours and picking off kids between the ages of 10 and probably not older than 14 off of street corners and soccer fields, and kidnapping them, essentially putting suicide belts around them or holding them at gunpoint and making them dig in the road and do the work. So I was confronted suddenly with a change of reality. What was in the cockpit, my reality was, 17 to 23-year-old military aged males, us versus them, to now a ground situation of, my God, we're engaging innocent children that were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And one particularly tough day was that we went out and there was this woman in a hijab, black, hijab, and she was all upset with her hands and with through the interpreter the best, and she had her son there in a wheelbarrow, and she kept going like this, and she said that her husband was away working, trying to get money for the family. It was her job to keep her son, their only son, which in Iraqi culture is like a massive thing, alive, and that it's just a matter of time when word gets around she's as good as dead, is what she was saying, as best we could tell through the interpreter. And I dealt with that. I figured war is hell. If we don't engage them, our convoy's at risk. We can't have that. I got back and I got promoted. I did the different things. And then about a year later, all within the course of 6 months, my brother died unexpectedly in his sleep after having some dental work done. My ex-husband and I divorced. And I got a tumor in my head. I needed brain surgery. And I started getting this feeling of karma, of, oh my God, now I'm getting my fill. And up until that point, nothing really had gone wrong in my life. I'd been very fortunate. I'd been very successful. I hadn't had any big traumas. But now things started really I felt turning against me. And I started getting consumed with all of the rhetoric of the news cycle of, the weapons of mass destruction aren't real. And I'm just going over and killing people in their backyards, essentially. And it's like everything that I was sure of, that I believed, and that I was willing to die for, turned inside out, and I had no control of it. And people tried to help me, and I tried to help myself, but I could not. I would get these intrusive thoughts, and it just would bother me. And I had the brain surgery. I felt better. I was put on these mental behavioral health drugs. I was touch and go for a while. And then I get to Kansas and I start having these symptoms and really struggling. And one thing led to another. And that's where it culminated, was in this really violent suicide attempt. And it wasn't any one thing that led to it. It was a culmination of things. I mean, I wish I could say that I could blame the mental behavioral health drugs, and I did go through a process where it was all the Army's fault. It was all my parents' fault, and these things they call adverse childhood experience. It was all my romantic partner's fault. It was all, my Catholic upbringing's fault. And then it was all my fault. And it was everything. There was a lot of fault and blame to be had. And then I finally came to this point where, and it took a long time and many helpers to come to the realization that nothing went wrong. There was no blame to place and there's no fault to be had. It was just something that happened. I don't know why. I can't explain it. There's no way to rationalize it. And then I had to come to a place of acceptance. And there was a therapist, I was having these, I bring up the lady in the hijab because my nightmares, she was always in my nightmares. And even I had waking nightmares where I would just see this action over and over again. I could not get it out of my mind. And I tell my therapist this, and she walked me through this process, and she said, well, why did you want to become a helicopter pilot? And I was a sophomore in ROTC in college, and there was an Apache pilot on staff there. And there's a joke that I was a pilot, so I can share it, but they say, how do you know if you're talking to a pilot? Well, they'll tell you. Well, an Apache pilot will tell you twice in case you missed it the first time. And this Apache pilot's ego, man, to get through the door, and there's some sibling rivalry in the military among airframes, but I heard him out in the hallway, strutting up and down the hallway. He says, why hasn't a cadet from this fine institution ever branched aviation? Aren't any of our cadets good enough? Well, Cadet Barlieb heard that in the back classroom and thought, well, by golly, I'm going to be good enough to get this aviation thing. And so I set my sights on the best PT score, the best weapons score. I joined the Ranger Challenge team. I did I went to jump school. I did all the things to ensure that I would be good enough to get that aviation. And sure enough, the time for selection, branch selection comes when we're seniors, and the executive officer calls me up and says, congratulations, you got aviation. What do you want to fly? Well, I had never, in my brilliance, I had never correlated getting aviation with flying anything. And I didn't even know what aircraft were in the Army inventory. And he said, oh my God, are you serious? Get out of here. I said, I hadn't thought it through that far. I was just set on being the best to get the thing. Well, they give you measurements before you actually get into aviation. You've got to go get measurements done to make sure you fit in the cockpit and you can reach all the things. Well, my wingspan was about half an inch too short. And I had to go down to Fort Indian Town Gap for what they called an in-cockpit evaluation with a flight examiner to hopefully get an exception to policy. So it's about 40 minutes away. I'm driving down there and I'm thinking to myself, my God, here it is. I've done everything I can do. And there's nothing I can do to change the length of my arms. It's going to be what it's going to be. I can't go out and run an extra 2 miles every day. I can't, write a letter to my congressman. I can't pay anybody off. I can't, there's nothing I can do. So I show up at Fort Indian Town Gap, and there's the flight examiner there with a clipboard. He explains to me what we're going to do. We're going to get in the cockpit. They're going to harness me in and simulate a crash sequence. And then he's got this long metal pointer, and he was pointing out all the things that I had to touch, and he was going to check them off the clipboard. So I get in, we harness in, and he starts pointing them out, and I start touching them and doing the things and flipping the switches, and I'm doing just fine. And then he says, good, go to the next one. He points it out, we do it. Then there's this one they call it a cross cockpit emergency switch. And this is if your pilot dies or is compromised, you're supposed to be able to take care of this switch. And I'm reaching, and I'm reaching, and I'm reaching, and my feet are coming up off the pedals. They're not supposed to, but they are. And I feel the harness cutting into my shoulder, and I exhale just to get that extra, to get that extra quarter inch. And there's daylight still between me and that switch. And I was sweating, and I thought, oh my God, this is it. It figures, this would just figure. And all of a sudden he says, good reach, cadet. And I sit back, and I look over at him, and he says, I hear the check mark on the thing, and he looks over at me, and he says, between you, me, and this clipboard, you touch that switch. Are we clear? I said, Roger that. And he said, very good. He's like, all right. And so I unbuckle. He's like, let's get you squared away. So we go into the office. He slides the clipboard across the counter, and he says, she's good to go. Let's get her wings and get her off to wherever she's supposed to be. So the therapist, in walking me back to that moment, was really trying to illuminate for me all the infinite amount of intersection decisions that had to have been made to get me to that particular point. And then on the other side, the child in the wheelbarrow had a similar path. I don't know what that path might have been, but there's 1,000,001 different choices and decisions, and we could call them mistakes, or we could call them miracles. We could call them awful, terrible timing, wrong place, wrong time, or perfect timing, right place. Whatever led us to be there together, to have that experience. And this kind of gets into deep controversial things, but there is the saying of there's no greater sacrifice than to lay your life for someone. And something I like to think of is that whatever caused that to happen, the sacrifice that was made for me to come to these realizations and deep understandings was a gift to me that is indescribable. Similarly, sometimes people will say about suicide that things have gone terribly wrong. They've lost connection or lost faith, but I feel, having been from my own experience, that there's a deep and profound reason why I did what I did. I don't know why. I can't rationalize. And that's why I say courage does not know. Courage has the courage to not know things, to not have it all figured out, to not have all the answers, to not have convinced itself that everything is all effed up and everything's upside down and inside out. It has the wisdom to take a deep breath and say, I don't know, but I'm going to trust. And the last thing that's probably worth sharing related to my experience is that I really surrendered after the suicide attempt. And I kind of said, all right, clearly whatever I'm doing isn't working. I'll just do whatever they tell me to do. And I just really kind of took orders, if you will, and tried my best to listen to people's advice. And I got a referral to go to this mental behavioral health, integrative health, mind-body therapist. And there's a lot of talk these days about self-care and breath work. And I reluctantly, you can imagine, I'm in my PT uniform, and that time they were gray. It was a gray shirt and the black pants, and I'm showing up to this lady's office, and you walk in, she opens the door, and there's a waft of lavender scent, essential oil, right? And her walls are painted this like light blue, and she's got seascapes, and she talked like this and kind of waved on the thing and was very soothing and welcomed me in. And we get to know each other. And her first assignment to me was to find a place on the campus and go lay out and look at the clouds. Okay. I'm a major in the United States Army. And this woman is telling me, your first assignment, I want you to go just find a quiet place on campus and just lay for 10, 15 minutes and watch the clouds go by. I did it. To be honest, I don't remember the last time I laid down and watched the clouds go by, but I did it. And then her next assignment to me was to get a journal, and she wanted me to keep a gratitude journal, and every day to write down 3 things, she said. At least 3 things, 5 would be ideal, but at least 3 every day that I'm grateful for. So I did not do a very good job of that in the beginning. But she would spot check it. And I was seeing her at that time. I was high risk for suicide. So I had to call in to a squad leader 3 times a day. And I was going to see her 3 times a week. And she would say, okay, I want you to bring your journal and I want to take a look at it. And she would look through it, and there would be maybe 1 thing listed. And usually it was, I'm grateful for breakfast, or my pain medication, or my nurse case manager. And that was pretty much it. And a lot of days were blank. They didn't have anything in them. And she would just say, hey, it's real important you do this. It's very important. And she kind of she said, if you don't do this, I'm going to put you down as non-compliant. And so I did the assignment, and I started getting more regular and consistent with it. And I had three things, and she would check it every couple of weeks. And I saw her for about, at this point, it was probably about 6 weeks, 6 months, 6, 7, maybe 8 months that I'd been seeing her. So I had racked up a good deal of items. And so she says to me one day, I want next appointment, day after tomorrow, I want you to bring your journal in. So I go ahead and I bring it in, and she says, let me have a look at it. And she flips through it. And then she hands it back to me, and she says, I want you to go to an entry where you have yourself or your name listed in there. And I sat with that journal in my lap, and I cried, because I knew nowhere in my journal had I ever written myself. I didn't have the answer that she was looking for. And I cried, and I cried, and I cried. And like the ugly cry. I mean, it was, and she very skillfully and graciously, like an angelic being, got up and got me the box of tissues. And she said, it's okay. She said, I wasn't expecting you to have your name or yourself in there anywhere. She's like, that's the point. And she said, that people who are inclined to serve don't often think of themselves. And that's a huge gift that we give the world. And it's a necessary gift. But there comes a point when we do have to face ourselves. And she said, without you, none of these other things that you're grateful for would be possible. You wouldn't be able to see, smell, taste, touch, hear, appreciate, or feel anything without you. She said, so from now on, I want you to continue to do this. And I want you to start every single journal entry with myself or your name or me, and then put your things down. And so I did. I took my journal. She would spot check it and I started this journal where I would put me. And then I noticed that once I did that, over time, I anchored myself in my own experience, and I would write down 5, 6, 7 things. And now, years later, this was back in 2015, and now I've got a stack of journals. These are all my gratitude journals. And I start every entry with myself. And you can see, like, it just goes on and on. Like there's day after day, and I have now two columns of things. And myself, all the things that I'm grateful for. And if every page of this has a myself on it, it's a practice. And that's why starting, I find it very important to make sure that we take time to see ourselves and to be with ourselves. Because without ourselves, nothing else can exist. And the power of our perspective and the wisdom that we've acquired is so unique and so important that courage would tell us that we don't even know how important it is or the significance that it has. And so I guess if I were able to give any homework as we close up and get ready to wrap up, is I would just encourage you to take an inventory every day of the things that you appreciate or that have been special to you, and make sure that you're on that list first and foremost. Make sure that you're on that list. And I would say if I can do it, and if a integrative health professional wearing a tree of life pendant on a leather neck around her, a leather chain around her neck, and a long flowing skirt can convince me to do it, then we can all do it. And it's important that we do it. The most courageous parts of ourselves would have us do it. And so I think, especially in a forum like this, where I know I'm talking to people who serve and who sacrifice so much, if there's any benefit to have been had from my own attempt, it would be for more people to have this realization, and that we help each other come to this realization. So on that note, I guess, unless there's any questions, or I'm happy to, if anybody has any questions or comments. It's a lot, and we'll just maybe, before we wrap up, make sure that we take a couple good breaths, and because it's a lot. And like I said, there's no easy way to talk about this subject. But it is a reality out there that we have to deal with. And that's just been my experience.
You come in an environment where mental health is stigmatized as well, right? It's especially in the military, like, I don't want to go to sick call. I don't want anyone to know. And then you have the spouses that are like, I can't get this on record, because then if we PCOS somewhere, like, this is gonna, like, it prohibit my spouse from promoting or getting to a certain base or something like that, right? How do you recommend starting that conversation or combating that kind of stigma in the environments that are very similar? Do you know what I mean? Like that first responder, military environment. How do you recommend destigmatizing mental health?
I think that I've met a lot of people over the last, 7 years in PTSD groups and trauma groups and suicide survivors groups um, and even medically retiring from the military. Like I didn't have much of a choice. Like I didn't, the way that I went about getting mental behavioral health treatment was I had a brain surgery um, that put me in the mental behavioral health office. And I often wonder, if I didn't have that physiological process going on, would I have had the wherewithal to go myself? My ex-husband, for instance, he had PTSD, was what I would call a functional alcoholic. He was a transporter in the war, and I was in aviation. So while we went to the same war, we had a dramatically different experience. And we didn't know it at the time. Like looking back, I can see how he had PTSD, and we didn't even, that wasn't really a thing. That this is 2007, 8. And I, it's a real challenge. And I think that one thing I know for sure is, and this is a controversial, I think, a perspective that I have about suicide and mental behavioral health issues, is that we really have very little control. Like we cannot impose, like I often say, friends who know me and have said, oh, if we had only known, we could have helped you. And, there's all these interventions that could be done. And we like to convince ourselves that there are things that can be done to change things. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't try, but I think it goes back to not knowing. I think really occupying, that's why I started with really calling forth our most courageous, our curious, our compassionate selves, because it's when we get into conceptualizing and the cognitive functioning of trying to understand these things, I think that sometimes we can do more harm than good. Like I just know in my case, I don't believe that there's anything that anybody really could have done to help me. I wasn't accessible. I wasn't porous enough. I wasn't penetrable. Like there, and that's a terrifying thing. Like I don't have children. And so I can't imagine what it might be like to have a child that is struggling and that you want to help, or you want to prevent from a catastrophic decision, or whatever it might be. But we are, I've found time and again that we're limited. We are limited in our ability to, that my suicide attempt, I think, really, it's something I grapple with. And I think it's something the greatest authors of all time have been trying to articulate or illustrate, is this idea between fate and free will. How much fate and versus free will do we have? And I think that idea about stigma, people are trying to avoid what they assume is going to be their fate if they seek out mental health, which is an illusion. Might not even be true. We don't know. And that's where, again, I think that the most courageous thing we can do, the most courageous thing of all time, particularly for people whose careers depend on being confident. And it's a real razor's edge. I think that any of us who've gone into service-oriented career professions, frontline, responders, any professional thing that's high stakes, we have in one way or another signed up for that razor's edge of paradox. And it requires graduate level, no shit ability to hold that space and learn it. You learn the ropes of that, just like you learn how to go up a ladder or do your hose drills or whatever it might be.
I appreciate that. To follow up on that, like, what was the big change for you to go from to go into advocacy, to like pay it forward and share your story and like to share your vulnerability? What was there a big thing, or was it just a general progression?
So in my treatment after the suicide attempt, like I said, I've met a lot of people who've tried to kill themselves, who struggle. And I heard all these stories, I've heard a lot of stories about, or people who've thought about it. There's like one story sticks out in my mind a lot. This guy, was sharing this story, and my God, like the trials and tribulations that he's been through. And he said, I was going to do the bridge. I was on my way. It was like 3 a.m. I was on my way to the bridge, and this was it. And there was a prostitute on the bridge smoking, and she just said, hey, and that was it. And that was enough to get him to turn around and go back home. And I heard that one sticks out in my mind because he was so vivid in the description, and I could almost feel as he was talking about it. And a lot of times people will say about there's these angels, there were these like divine interventions or these angelic, things that got them to put the gun away, or, the dog came and did something or what, and I remember thinking back to the night of my attempt, and I thought about all the actions that I took, and I said, where is my angel? I don't ever remember anybody. I mean, I went to Walmart and I bought the scissors, and I bought the wire, and I bought the permanent marker. I went and I to the gas station, and I filled up my tank of gas. And I was thinking of all these opportunities where there could have been that night a moment of an intervention, right? And if there was one, I wasn't aware of it. And
I think your angel was standing by your pole, my dear.
And so many people, when I lament over that, they say, oh, your angel was there. And so I feel that there's a responsibility. I'm not convinced. I'm not on a mission to go out and save people. I would never, and this is where it gets controversial about my attempt, I wouldn't take my attempt back. I don't go around beating my chest and advocating it's not a self-help method. I don't encourage suicide attempt as a self-help method at all. But in my unique experience, in my life trajectory, it was absolutely necessary to get my attention, because I had worked myself into such a state of superiority complex and perfectionism. And I convinced myself that I had this whole thing figured out. I lost my connection with magic and curiosity and faith and mystery, and the cynicism that I was consumed with, and skepticism, and taking score and this and that and transaction. I mean, I think I needed an experience where there was not a single other person to blame. It was my foot on the gas pedal. It was me who went and bought all the things. It was me who put the tank of gas. It was all me deliberately. So essentially, I had vacated myself. And it took that to realize that it's under my agency to stay with myself, which is why multiple times throughout the day, and even starting a session like this, I always want to take a look. I'm not looking, I'm seeing. And when I'm doing that, I'm also looking at my box and I'm saying, am I in here? First and foremost, like, yes, of course, I want to make sure all of you are in here. But first and foremost, I'm asking, hey, am I in here? Am I present and accounted for? And then what state am I in?
Did your family, or does your family continue to support you in a way that you would recommend that was helpful for you?
So this is an interesting thing. The way that I grew up, and so I grew up in a family. When I first started therapy and they asked me how my family was, how my family life was, I said it was great. You know, I was well cared for. I had a roof over my head, good food, you know. And as my therapist started to really kind of ask questions, I learned the degree of trauma that I was exposed to as a child. There is no judgment and there's no criticism. I love my parents dearly and they did the best they could. And they did well, but you know, I would say that I had a lot of logistical support growing up, but I had no emotional support. Like my emotional support from my family or my parents it was not there. Like if I ever needed soccer cleats or tennis rackets or flute lessons, and they curried me all over the place to get to I mean, this is in the 1980s. And I like to say I was programmed before programming was cool. 9 days a week, I was doing soccer, tennis, softball, flute lessons, theater, you name it. And I was doing it, and very active. And on top of that, my dad, I grew up with an autistic brother who couldn't hear and speak, and was very difficult to manage and caused a lot of rage in my father. And there was a lot of physical abuse that occurred. Never towards me, but I witnessed this physical abuse. So like my handicapped brother who couldn't defend himself. And I thought, man, I don't want to have any part of that. So I kind of became this, like, perform, do well, stay off the radar. And I didn't really appreciate how traumatic that was and how my nervous system was calibrated and really in like a defense posture, and normalizing it, because to survive, I normalized that. And I figured, well, I kind of transmuted it towards, I took all that energy that wasn't safe essentially, and I pushed it into performing and serving. I was rewarded and recognized for my service. Hey, good job. So, and the proxy for emotional support was Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. I don't, depending on your age group or whatever, but Mr. Rogers was my guy. And so he was the one who told me, no matter what you do, you're loved and you're special and you're wonderful. But then it created this thing of like, well, what's on TV isn't really real, because what I'm experiencing at home is like, shit, kids aren't even safe. And I grew up in the fire company. My father was in the fire company. And so we had a scanner, and we would know when all the calls were going on and where the trucks were going and who was doing what and whatever. And one night it got especially bad, and I called the police because there was craziness going on in the bathroom, and my mom was saying, get off me. And so I called the police, and my dad had calmed down and kind of put on this facade and was like, everything is fine. And I had kind of quieted down, like, oh my God, I'm going to get killed after this. And that didn't happen. But what I'm trying to get at is that there was a facade of performance. And my mom especially was very happy to have a United States Army major daughter. She was very proud of that, and talked about it at the library and the community events and all of the different things. And I kind of colluded in that without really taking to task what was going on emotionally, the emotional reality of what was going on at home. And so I compartmentalized and put all that trauma away, and quite frankly, forgot about it until years later. I'm in the therapist's office after this massive suicide attempt, and they're digging into my childhood, background. I mean, I knew I had combat related trauma. That was quite obvious. I wasn't denying that. But for all intents and purposes, I believed that I had a very good childhood growing up. And on some aspects, I did. I had a phenomenal childhood, but there was this thing. So when it comes to emotional support, something that did factor into my attempt, I had two options. I could either do a single motor vehicle accident, or there was a train. And I thought, well, I could go jump in front of the train. What figured into my decision making was, and this is how dangerous normalizing outside perceptions is. I thought to myself, keeping up the perfect daughter appearance and this perfectionist facade and everything's good. I thought, well, when my parents are asked what happened to Anne, I want them to be able to say, oh, she was just in a really terrible accident. They can't say that if I jump in front of a train, right? I mean, that's how do you accidentally jump in front of a train? So I decided that to protect my parents, I would have this single motor vehicle accident. Remarkably, to this day, my mother does not acknowledge the suicide attempt. There's many defense mechanisms that we go through. And it's taken me a lot of therapy to realize that, you know, my mom was also going through abuse, and there was dynamics between my mother and father that, you know, like I had my mom on a pedestal for many years and thought my dad was just this monstrous man who could not, you know, regulate his temper. But the more that I kind of learn about relationship dynamics and patterns, I mean, it's a complex. And again, when it comes down to courage, courage doesn't know, and courage doesn't have it all figured out. And courage makes room for compassion and for people, like we just started tonight, to be imperfect. I might bring out my best tonight and do my best work here tonight, and it's still going to be imperfect. I'm going to offend somebody. I'm going to hurt somebody's feelings. And that's why being a courageous listener and audience member to our life experience, whether it's the dynamics between our parents, it's how we're parenting our children, it's, you know, the guy, you know, at the fire company that is all out of control and is making decisions that don't make any sense to anybody. It takes a great amount of courage to be in those circumstances and to just be in the circumstances exactly as they are. So the question being that, you know, my mom is not my parent. My dad has since passed. He had stage 4 lung cancer, and he died a year ago, March. And I, because I decided to go down this path of healing and kind of coming to terms, it has created two different realities with my parents. And I could no longer collude with or conform to or comply with my mom's version of reality, which is, oh, everything's fine, and we're just not going to address these emotions anymore. I couldn't do that anymore. And so then there's a grieving process that's related to that whole thing, and accepting where she is and being where I am. And I think it really has given me a skill to really acknowledge the human experience is wrought with all of these things. Everybody, there's not a single person. And if you were to know my mom at home, I mean, you figure on the board at the library, at the VFW, and Little Miss Perfect, and always in all of her great outfits. And you would never guess. You would never guess that there's all of this stuff. You know, and she still addresses my mail as Major Ann Barlieb.
I lived this life with my mother. So like, and Amy's even texting me like, hi, are you hearing this? Because like I lived this life with my mom as well. And I feel like oh my gosh, like we live very similar experiences. And I can't thank you for that vulnerability. It's ridiculous. It's just ridiculous, the gift that you've given this evening. I'm so grateful for you. Does anybody else have any questions or anything? Okay, with that, then I'm going to stop the recording for the evening. And then we'll ask some questions if anyone has any in the confidential environment. On behalf of the collaborative, thanks for blowing my mind tonight and for your willingness to share your story. I'm very grateful for you. Remember, if anyone needs help out there, never hesitate to reach out. There are people who want to help. And thank you so much for this evening.